Welcome, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter to Showcase Broadcast Studios to our live broadcast. My name is Michael Wardy, Certified Financial Planner and Regional Director at Source Advisors. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today across the world. I'm really excited. I'm always excited for my guests to come in studio, but today, this one I'm excited about, especially because when I was speaking with Nelson I think it was about a month or so ago, and he brought up something that was interesting. And for those that saw my posts on LinkedIn and YouTube, more than likely you saw where it said put 10 CEOs into a room and ask them to define what a CFO is, and you'll get 10 different answers. That right there piqued my curiosity, and I thought that bringing Nelson in to talk about this and when your company does need a CFO is incredibly, incredibly important. So with that, Nelson, Tepfer, I would like to welcome you to Showcase Broadcast Studios, and thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Nelson, just to get started, I want you actually to introduce yourself and ProCFO and where you guys came into the picture with the vision and really everything about ProCFO. If we can start there, and then we'll talk more about the CFO's role. I also obviously want to talk about the financial flywheel.
Sure. So I am the Nelson Tepfer, the co-founder and managing partner of ProCFO Partners. We're really a team of we're up to nearly 30 CFOs and providing part-time CFO services. We believe most companies simply don't need a full-time CFO, and we feel somewhat qualified in making that statement, as both myself and every member of my team have been an actual CFO before. It's been a very interesting, we built this company and we offer this because we believe every business deserves an expert CFO to guide their success. Just as we believe every expert CFO deserves a platform to practice in a way that's meaningful to them. What that means is very often when we do get called in, we see many issues that should have been or could have been solved a long time beforehand if they actually recognize when the need was there much earlier, as opposed to when we actually get called in and we end up having to clean up the mess before we can help build it. But what we focus on is not just selling access to our time, but really building a framework for financial management and growth.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And it's interesting when we talked about when does a company need a CFO and when don't they? It's challenging. Is that fair to say? That's challenging to understand when it's time. And a lot of companies. Go ahead.
It's a very challenging concept, and to the point that you made earlier, based on when we first had it, I think I went even a little bit further when I said it. Is when I've actually asked, in a room of about 15 to 20 CEOs, how many of them have a CFO, and about half of them raise their hand. And I said, great, then what does a CFO do? That's when you start getting all different answers. And this is companies who actually have a CFO. And unfortunately, it's really because there is no official definition for CFO other than it standing for Chief Financial Officer. We've seen CFOs of really large organizations who are glorified bookkeepers, and CFOs of really small organizations who are basically the CEO and everything in between. And what and how that role evolves within an organization very often depends on the structure that's there beforehand, who are the professionals that are already working with beforehand, as opposed to what does the company need. Where is the company in its evolutionary cycle? What are the skills? What is the management side? What is the framework that needs to be built? What is the foundation that needs to be put in place to actually support their continued growth and scale?
So I know we're going to get into this where ProCFO Partners comes into the mix of it. Maybe I'm a little premature in asking this, but how do you guys fit in? Really, when does it make sense to start talking to you guys? Because we're talking about different size companies, different industries. When does a company need to, maybe we switch over, Nelson, I'll let you lead it, but maybe we switch over to the financial flywheel to get a better understanding.
So that's a great way to do it. And I'll share the screen there as well to do that. Because the real answer becomes into play when it's, let me just share my whole screen. Oh, there we go. I can just share this one.
There we go.
Okay. So we start getting into, well, how we define the CFO, and please feel free to jump in with the questions or comments or any other things, to guide this conversation, because there's a lot of information here, and I want to make
Absolutely.
sure it helps with everyone listening in.
Nelson,
So this is.
Nelson, I do want to add for our audience, our subscribers, everybody, if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in, whether you're on LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube. Go ahead and type those in, send those in, and I will get those posted so that Nelson can answer those.
So we'll start off with the accounting definition of a CFO, but it's not one which I tend to focus on at all, because leave the accounting firm, again, not to denigrate the industry as a whole, but leave them to come up with an overly wordy answer that doesn't really mean anything. But this is an important distinction to recognize, whereas once the CFO was viewed just as the gatekeeper, now they're actually more responsible for driving the growth of the company instead of just keeping an eye on things that are going on. That's not to say keeping an eye isn't an important part of the function. It is, but the real value comes in more in the catalyst and the strategist function of actually driving the growth of the company.
Mm-hmm.
So to get a sense of some of the different components within the financial function, obviously not every company has all 6 of these different functions on the side. But these are the impact of these types of roles. So many organizations may have a bookkeeping function, they have an external accountant, and then they have somebody senior within the company. That can be a controller, that can be, or any of the above. Depending on the size of the organization is the complexity of the function that they need to build out. Some of them have 5 people at the bookkeeper level. Some of them have 2 people at the senior levels, a controller and a VP of finance and a CFO. So it'll really vary. The point, though, that we should look at is what is the actual impact of the level of these roles. So the bookkeeper type function, and again, you can exchange bookkeeper for any level, for more the level of the person instead of the title.
Mm-hmm.
But at the entry level person, it's more of the task oriented type of functions within the financial. They're the ones who are doing the day-to-day entries, bank reconciliations, things like that. That's happening the day-to-day. How do we enter? How do we bill? How do we, making the collections happen? The accountant, the external accountant, that's far more on the reporting side and the tax side of things, which is a very important function, which is, obviously needs to be managed by from an internal perspective, but it's actually handled externally by tax accountants. But as you move up into the management levels, this is where you start getting real value for this function, whether it's reviewing or building internal systems, the actual analysis that comes with the data that you have. So it becomes insight, not just data, insight, not just information, as well as then the management of the rest of the team in this function, the communication, whether to internal or external stakeholders. And finally, at the top level, you actually get the leadership and strategy, which is really the greatest value in this role. This is where we get to, and this function is really about what is the role of this finance and accounting function. What is this foundational element that really drives what this function should be doing for you? And therefore, whoever is managing it, whatever title you choose to give them, what is it that they should be delivering for you? Mm-hmm. And that's the financial flywheel which we created.
Perfect. That's, I know what we want to see.
Right. So, there's no real natural starting place because it is a flywheel. So it does go round and round and round. I tend to like starting from this point of the conversation because it helps, I think of this as when you think of systems and processes, I think of this as the area of what's going on day to day that makes the company tick. For instance, systems can be which actual software they're using. There are quite a few different levels and packages of softwares, everything from, where everyone starts with QuickBooks or Xero, all the way up to the ERPs of the world. And there are dozens we can list here, but from our perspective, it always comes down to what should these systems be doing for you? Because bad systems or bad system implementations can cripple a company.
True.
So that's what we focus on when we think of systems. Processes is more about the financial operations, is how certain things get up, is how certain things get set up, as in how do you bill your clients? How do you collect from your clients? But in addition to that is also what's going on day to day that makes the company tick. For instance, which accountant are you working with? Which lawyer? Which banker? Which 401k? Which payroll? Not because we care which ones they're using with from our perspective, but because we want to make sure companies have the right value for these professional relationships. When you set many of them up, you have no idea what you're going to be needing from them. But as you grow and evolve, what you need from these professionals will change. And very often it requires someone who has been there before to recognize that, oh, you really should be getting this amount from your accountant, or this lawyer while is a great attorney for the things we used him for in the past, is not really a good value to use him for these next things that we need him for.
That's very true. Now, so are you moving your slides forward?
Yeah, I will be. Right now,
Okay.
not.
I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't
Yeah,
frozen.
this is still the systems and processes one.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So clearly, there's a lot that goes into into the thoughts and the discussion and the definition. So thank you.
Sure. Moving on to the reporting function. Now, this is built in order in a specific order for a reason. For instance, as we heard you mention over here, is how certain information gets entered or managed when it comes to billing or collecting or even just regular entry, and which system you're actually using, because all of that informs the reports that you can get out of that system, that you can get out of all the data that you entered. So when we think of reporting, yeah, of course, we hope that, the financial statement reporting happens correctly and timely. But from our perspective, this also goes into, okay, what else are we measuring? What else are we looking at that lets us know what's going on inside the company?
Mm-hmm.
We can prefer, this is where we'll get into the conversation of KPIs. What are we using to measure, and why are we using those? What are we measuring them against? And we'll circle back to this as we continue to go through the flywheel, because this comes back as well once we get involved in setting our goals, because that's what we would want to set those KPIs to measure against, how well we are doing towards achieving these goals. But when we think of reporting, again, this goes back to the statement I made slightly earlier. It's insight we're looking for, not just information. Insight, not just data, because that's what will help a business owner or a CEO or an executive team make the strategic decisions they need to continue to guide the growth of the company.
So has this analysis, and maybe I know the answer already, but I'll ask it. Has this analysis, as you've gone through and learned more, has it evolved over the years from where a company was 10, 15 years ago or 20 years ago to where it is now?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. For instance, think of that company that starts out. Yeah, they need to be managing, their gross margin, their net margin, and depending on the size of the company, there'll be various measurements that they'll be looking for. There'll be various KPIs that they'll be looking for to measure their performance. But as companies grow, you start building up an inventory, you start building up a team, and you have to start measuring the performance or how quickly your inventory turns or how much revenue you're generating per employee. That's when things obviously, and that's at its most basic level, once you start growing in that function. As you grow more and more, there's a lot more insight you should be getting from this reporting function, because these are the ones you want to make sure you're doing. Customer retention can be a good one. You start measuring once you have customers long enough, and you want to see how much revenue per customer, revenue per region. There's many different ways you can start breaking down this information, and you should have it. But it's also just as important to recognize what are the things you need to be looking at that actually affects the growth of the company, because you can look at, I think you can come up with 40 or 50, measurements, metrics, and ratios, which sound all good things to measure, and they are. But you also have to understand, okay, this is what I am measuring because this is the result I'm trying to achieve.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for answering.
Sure. Cash management or cash flow. Companies run into cash flow issues companies of all shapes and sizes and ages run into cash flow issues for various reasons. It is a very important one with growing companies, because more companies fail due to poor cash flow than to poor profitability. So it's a very important part of managing the growth process. Cash flow issues only come from, at its most basic, only come from one of two areas. It is too much going out or not enough coming in. But when we look at it, is we try and identify what's actually going on. Are fixed costs too high, or variable costs not being captured by pricing? Are customer terms too lenient, or you're not taking advantage of supplier terms? Or are there other underlying issues? And usually it's some combination of all of the above. Now, again, we look at this one after we look at the reporting function, because among the first things we're going to want to look at when we see a cash flow problem is, okay, what does the cash flow forecast look like? How far out are they projecting? How accurate has their cash flow projections been in the past? Because in order to manage it, you have to be able to project what's coming in and what's going out and when.
That makes sense. But
at the same time, we've seen those scenarios where there's no cash flow forecast, and obviously it's a lot harder to manage that when you run into those types of issues.
True.
Moving into profit improvement is where are you making money from, not just generating revenue. And again, depending on the company sizes and what we've seen in this space, it really varies. So for instance, we've seen really big companies where, look, our margins are profitable and everything is good, except once we broke down what else was going into keeping that particular customer happy, the account that we were looking at, we realized as a net margin it actually was not profitable. So profitability, again, this comes down to cross-sectioning and looking at the data in every which way possible to give you the insight you need to. This can be profit per salesperson, profit per line item, profit per SKU, profit per any way you want to look at it. But you have to look at how these things are actually impacting the company. Contribution and net margins, not just gross margins. But in addition, it's knowing where your break evens are across these items to know, okay, I know I need to earn this amount. If my pricing doesn't affect it, this is where pricing comes back into play. Where and how you adjust pricing to affect your profits is a really important part of that.
So these are all things, these are all, I shouldn't say things, these are all activities and work that's being done at the CFO level, at the CEO level. Who's doing
it? So that's where it varies by the company. And that's why, forget the title of CFO. This is more the finance and accounting function, what this should be doing in driving the growth of the company.
Got it.
From our perspective, we don't care what you call the person who makes sure you have this insight. As long as you have the insight, you're good.
That's fair. Yep.
Yeah. So usually it does take someone who has been there before or someone at the senior level to put all of this together. But again, it will be broken down into different pieces depending on the size of the company. Sometimes it's just a bookkeeper and a CFO, and all of this, results, falls on their shoulders. But there's a lot of automation that can be built into these types of things, so that there's automatic. This amount is this report is what we're looking at on a regular basis. So it doesn't mean you have to have 50 people in the function in order to do this. I've seen this done with 1 or 2 people.
Okay.
Goals and strategies, this is really among the most important elements to this. And this certainly usually falls more at the C-suite or on the senior level. And because it really gets down to what is it we're trying to build here with this company? What is this owner? What is the CEO? What is his vision for the company, his or her vision for the company? Because that's what will define so much else of what's being built in this function. For instance, there's an old cartoon. You see a bunch of people sitting around a conference table, a board meeting almost, and you see them with this money in the table, and they're, well, if we only spend $5 on sales and marketing this year, we have money for pizza for lunch. So making sure we understand the goals of what we're trying to do becomes far more important as we go through the rest of the function. For instance, if all we want is pizza for lunch, great, then we'll spend $5 on sales and marketing and we're good. If we want to actually grow the company by X number amount within a specific time frame, then it becomes a different budget, becomes different forecasts, becomes different KPIs that you measure towards achieving them. So when we think of goals, it comes around to, okay, well, first, what is the vision for what we're trying to do? Coming up with the goals means coming up, yes with these targets, but then it becomes also being very specific about those measurable targets. Meaning it's not just a concept, but how do we come up with a measurable target around it? For instance, we want to grow. Is not a goal. While that maybe sound like a great sentiment, without getting specific of we want to add 5 million in top line revenue within 3 years, it becomes far hard. Once we have the second part of that statement filled out, then we can actually develop a strategy towards doing it. So yes, it becomes getting clear with the vision, getting clear with the goals and the measurable targets around it, so we can build a strategy to actually go and achieve it.
Yeah. That makes sense. I would agree.
From there, we go back down to the revenue model of where, how is your company actually generating this revenue? What is the problem you're solving for in the marketplace? What is your solution to that problem? What makes you unique? Where is your positioning? What are your customer channels? What are your revenue streams? Again, from our perspective as CFOs, this is through the financial lens, because we're looking at it as, okay, well, we set all of these things up in our goals and our strategies. What is our business, we'll call it, when you think about the revenue model, what is our overall business that we're in that's going to help us achieve those? Because once we establish, again, what that process looks like and how we're going to do this, we go back around to the bottom of the systems and processes. Then we have to go build those to support the revenue model that we just identified that's going to support those goals, which is why this is an iterative function and not one that just, okay, great, I checked it off. I did my cash flow forecast, I'm finished. Or yes, I outlined my goals, I'm done. This is an iterative function and it absolutely goes round and round.
Understood. Thank you. All right.
So I'll stop sharing this one for the moment, but if anyone is interested in this, please feel free to reach out to either one of us.
Let's talk a little bit more about the financial flywheel, and if we can get into the evolution of it and then we could share back into that so that people can see exactly what it's all about. Because when you were walking through it with me, it's a different thought process than what I've traditionally experienced and understood. So definitely having an explanation of it and an understanding of it and the value behind it, I think will help a lot of people.
Sure. So, we'll start with where a lot of this evolved. My partner and I were thinking about this a lot when we were talking about what is it that we do when we work with clients, as part-time CFOs. What is it that we actually do with them? And we started, just the two of us started identifying some, pretty similar experiences. We'll start with this, and then we'll do this, and then we do this. So we started talking to, the early, this early CFOs who joined our team early on, and identifying this. So now you're talking about probably several hundred years of experience at the CFO level in a room discussing what are the 6 key areas of the finance and accounting function. And, looking at it from a, more of a bird's eye view, not getting into the details, which is obviously what you just saw in the financial flywheel. And these 6 key elements kept coming up. So that's what that's where we came down to, boiling it down to, okay, these are the 6 basic areas. Now, obviously, in different companies, and I want to clarify this, of course, but obviously in different companies, different parts may be a focus at different points in time, and as it should be. Like, there are some companies, obviously, if you're going through an ERP implementation, obviously your systems and processes is probably going to be front and center, throughout that process. And depending on how big or how large of that ERP project is how time consuming, or how much of the focus, is put on that.
Right.
So all of us in our experience, we've done different levels of each of these different components, but essentially this is what it boils down to: is these are the 6 basic areas, I'll call it. It's not even key. These are the 6 foundational areas, and how these all fit together towards driving the growth of the company.
Okay. All right. Well, before we get into that financial flywheel, I do want to ask, and I had a question actually emailed to me, so it didn't make it onto the screen. Does every company need a CFO, in your opinion?
So,
and it's hard to, I guess it's hard to answer.
So here's how I'll say it.
Okay.
Every company needs a CFO's perspective. Whether they actually go and get one, whether they get the advice of one, or whether they learn what it is that perspective provides for them. Every company needs a CFO's perspective in guiding their growth. And again, when you go and get one becomes when you are not getting that CFO's perspective from your current professionals or current, trusted advisor group that you have around you. And or when you need that insight that's going to drive the growth and you're not getting it. So that's how I'll put it. Every company should have a CFO's perspective. Yes. When you actually need to hire the role as a part-time or fractional or whatever, or as a full-time, becomes when the company, well, hopefully it's in advance, but when you realize the company is going to need that to continue its scale and growth. When the lack of that perspective at the level you need it is now causing more issues. So it's when you need that strategic insight in guiding the scale and growth of the company, that strategic financial insight. When you need this framework to work all together, because we talk about it, as our roles as CFOs, we're the ones in the middle making sure that entire flywheel turns.
Right.
So when you need this entire function turning, or when it stops turning, that's when you should go for outside help.
So, okay. So follow up to that question. I understand it that a couple of people I've talked to historically, they didn't know when, not whether, but when. When do you start consulting with? At what point? We work with all different size companies, all different types of industries. When should you start putting it on your radar even?
Sure. So, similar to you, to your company, what you work with, we were obviously run quite a range with what we deal with. So literally everything from pre-revenue up to a few $100 million in revenue across nearly 30 industries. So it's not a specific dollar amount. It's more when, as a CEO, business owner, you don't have the insight you need to. And keep focusing back on the insight for a lot of it, because for a lot of what we get involved with at the strategic level, it is providing that insight. So I've heard the statement of, when we're working with our clients, great, now I can sleep at night because I know this is being taken care of. which speaks more to the sentiment as opposed to, oh, great, now I know, anything specific, which of course we've delivered for that client, but it speaks more to the sentiment of what's being delivered. Or when we're talking to a CEO and he tells me, this company's too big to run on gut instinct. Because very rarely do people go out and say, now I need a CFO, but they start recognizing a lot of those problems along the way. So it's, I don't know, I'm having trouble figuring out how I'm going to achieve my goals. For instance, if we're sitting where we are right now, I want to double my company in 3 years. I'm not really sure how to do it. That's probably a good time to have a conversation with for someone from this perspective.
Okay.
Or I'm trying to, again, you run into the problem ones very often. Sure, cash flow problems, shrinking profitability, those types of issues, poor performance in the company overall. Those are always good times to have a CFO. But I'm trying to be more, allow people to be more proactive in recognizing the symptoms before it turns into those issues. And that's why I focus more on the insight, is when you don't have the insight into the company, those issues are the ones that start developing. You run into cash flow issues, you run into shrinking profitability, you run into the overall company shrinking as a gross revenue side. You run into lots of issues when you're not keeping that level of perspective in mind.
Got it. Okay, so thank you for sharing that insight. We have a couple of questions. One is, can you address lean accounting and how a CFO leads that process?
Lean accounting, you said?
Yes. Let me put up the post.
Sure.
That'll help you.
So the short answer is usually the CFO leads the entire accounting process internal to a company. So again, many of us have worked in different industries who can speak to the specifics of each one differently. My experience has been across quite a few different industries. But a lot of it comes down to setting up the internal processes for it and making sure the right pieces are in place, and then reporting on what that function actually looks like. So it'll vary. Again, I haven't heard it referred to as lean accounting or referring to it in the manufacturing space versus this, but the short version is, as a CFO, we're very often tasked with making sure the processes get set up and is managed and reported on correctly. So again, that means identifying identifying how they're going to be doing it, what is each person's function within that process, to make sure that the actual function gets built out in that reporting area.
Got it. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, Nelson, I do want you to go through the financial flywheel, because I found it worthwhile. And I think what you put together is significant value for those that are participating today. So can we switch over to that?
Sure. Let me switch back to that one.
And while you're doing that, Karen, thank you for your posts. I appreciate that.
So I'm going to go through just the whole one at the end, the full one. Now, each one of these, I will point out, have their own flywheels. Each one of these larger orange circles have their own flywheels. And
wait, we're not seeing that. We're only seeing the first page.
Which page are you seeing? Sorry.
It says, what is a CFO?
Oh. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, let me see if I can go into that one.
Yeah, we're on it.
Okay. Will it move? Did you move on to the next one, or are we still stuck on the first one?
We're on the financial flywheel.
Okay. So this is the overall one. Now, each one of these have their own flywheels as well, which we usually don't get into until we're getting more specific on one of these areas. But each one of these have their own flywheel and how we guide many companies through this. This provides that framework. This provides that foundation for companies to begin to understand where the different components are, how it all plays together, and how we need to manage it towards driving the growth and scale of the company.
Got it.
So I will go through, just pull up the next ones just quickly, just for more to see it, that there is more, in each of these goals and strategies, for instance, flywheel, the revenue flywheel, and how these all flow together. But usually, again, most of the time we spend our time at this top level, which is here. It's not most of the time, but most of the time when I speak about it, I usually stop over here. But I'm happy to go into any of the other ones if they're interested.
Okay. Well, I guess in the interest of time, and like you said, each business is unique and is specific to those needs. where does ProCFO Partners fit into the picture? Again, as we're going through this, we're thinking about businesses that are all walks of life. Where do you guys fit into the picture?
Sure. So as you know, we provide part-time CFO services in building, and what our CFOs go in and do is actually help build this framework within companies or manage this framework within companies, depending on the pieces that get built out. Because it is our perspective, it is our experience in having done this before that we're able to come in to say, okay, these is the pieces of this flywheel that work, and this is the ones we need to focus on. Usually, when we get called in, there is some type of issue already going on,
Mhm.
and usually can be boiled down to one of these 6 areas. Usually, it's more than one, unfortunately, when we get called in. But a lot of it comes down to building this framework that's going to provide that clarity, building this framework that's actually going to be foundational towards that growth of that company. So as CFOs, for instance, we get called in and say, okay, they're having cash flow issues. So in the cash management area, yeah, sure, we'll go out and negotiate with the bank. We'll go out and help them get lines of credit or things like that for that. But it is in the context of this greater flywheel. It's not just, oh, I need more cash and I need to get a line of credit. For our perspective, when we hear this, it's okay, where does that fit? It means where have you gotten into an issue over here that you now need to go out and get a larger line of credit, or that your current line of credit isn't good enough? Sometimes it's systems and processes, sometimes it's cash flow, sometimes it's goals and strategies. You want to get a bigger line of credit in place so you can go on take on larger jobs, because that's where we've identified that's where we need to be to continue to grow the company. So
Mhm.
sure, get a larger line of credit that's in support of your goals and strategies, because you want to take on larger jobs. That's your revenue model. But the systems and processes that require to change to a different bank and the cash flow, so a lot of the things that we get involved with hit many of these areas, which is why this is that foundation, and then we build the different pieces on top of it.
Got it. And what I've found in talking with you and talking with others within ProCFO is that each person within ProCFO has a niche, has a specialty, and it's not just a generic, hey, we do everything. It's unique amongst.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for pointing that out. For
Okay.
instance, in professional services firms or for instance, manufacturing, it's not just that we say we can do this. We have people on our team who have grown manufacturing companies into, several hundred people and several hundred million in revenue. We have
Yeah.
people who have actually gone on that journey before. And so we're able to leverage everyone's experience when we work with our clients. You're talking about the startup or SaaS space. We have people who have literally been the CFO and guided companies through that phase before, or literally every other industry you can think of, which is why, it's like we get asked very often, oh, have you worked in this industry? And the short answer almost always is yes, because when you're talking about nearly 30 CFOs from varied backgrounds, we literally have been in so many different ones, not-for-profits, law firms, doctors groups, of course, manufacturing, every type of professional service firm imaginable we've been involved with in some way, shape, or form. So we really come from actually having done this before for those industries, for these types of companies.
And that's huge for a business to know that when they contact you, it's not just going to be some generic person. It's going to be somebody that gets their business, gets their industry.
Absolutely. Not only do we get it, but as a team, we speak about the different issues that some clients, we go through this as a team. So we'll reach out and say, okay, we have a client who's facing this type of issue. Does anyone have a good resource? Does anyone have a good solution for this? And so you don't just get the CFO in front of you, but you also get the rest of the team actually involved and their experience in actually coming up with the solution for it. So you get a bunch of CFOs on focus on any specific goal or task or issue, usually come up with some pretty good solutions.
Perfect. All right. So I do have more questions if you're still good with time, Nelson.
Sure. I'm
All
good.
right. So this one comes from Don Brooker, and I just have to do a special shout out to Don. It's been a while since we spoke. Hello. Tell your family I said hello. Don's question is, as a CFO, how do you evaluate if and what advertising is paying dividends?
So you're getting into the ROI of an expense, essentially. So advertising, for instance, is one area of marketing where you go into how you're doing it. So a lot of it's going to depend on channel, how you're actually advertising and what the return you're getting on it is. It does get a little bit more complicated depending on how many efforts you do, how many different things you're doing in this space. But depending on if it's PPC or SEO, some of those have more direct metrics you can look at to build into place. In general, there is a greater brand investment that can be looked at. For instance, if it'll be more important to identify the customer journey in your advertising to be able to assess the return on it, because your customer journey may be an impression they got from something you've done, and you will not necessarily be able to capture it unless you have the correct metrics in place or the correct tools in place to really capture. So the short version is, depending on the channels or depending on what you're doing, is how you would measure it. But if you're working with an outside firm, that's certainly one of the questions that we would ask them, is how we would measure the return on what they're doing. But if you're doing it internally, then it becomes what efforts are you doing and how are you tracking those efforts versus the return that they're providing for you.
Got it. All right. And another question came through. As a small business owner, they base their expansion and acquiring of assets off depreciation schedule to minimize tax liability. Is that a good or a bad strategy?
Without knowing the specifics, I would say that's probably more a.
That's probably the right answer too.
I would say that also may be more of your accountant type question. So if you don't have the clarity on that one, that would probably be the first place I would go, because you're talking about the impact on tax side of things. As CFOs, we definitely get involved in more coordinating the tax strategy of it. Depending on the size or depending on the expertise, depending on the industries, how much we'll get involved in what we do to make sure of that. But very often, because we work in more of the small to middle market space, we're very often more coordinating with external tax advisors and saying, okay, this is what we're trying to do, and rely on their expertise to guide it, instead of us trying to be the tax expert as well as the CFO.
Got it. Okay. And then a follow-up question from Karen. Pushing payments to suppliers, and I apologize for moving around like this. Is that a red flag? What is the best way to protect your company if they go bankrupt?
So there are a few different types of things. Again, depending on the specifics of how this arrangement gets set up, there are reinsurance products. There are, AR insurance type products, AP, there's a lot of different ways you can set this up. If issues do get bad, again, if you're talking about to your suppliers and you want to get the money back, again, if they go bankrupt, bringing in the right outside help as quickly as possible is always going to be the best way to do it. And when I say that is, depending on when you engage a creditor bankruptcy attorney may depend on whether you get paid or not, for instance, in the extreme scenario. So don't hesitate or wait or hope that certain things will happen. By all means, be proactive for your business. On the receiving side, there are different types of insurance products, but depending on the risk that this arrangement is exposing your company to, are which ones would make sense to look into.
Perfect. Okay. Nelson, I want to thank you again for joining today. I appreciate it. And again, for those businesses that are out there that no matter the size, no matter what they're looking at, growth, all that, giving and gaining clarity on that position and that role of a CFO and where they fit in, whether you have one or you don't have one, whether you're thinking about it, not thinking about it, highly recommend getting in touch with Nelson. I have his contact information scrolling under there, nelson.tepfer@ProCFOPartners.com. His phone number is right there. They have teams all over and very proactive. They do a great job. I've seen and experienced that with some of our clients as well. So Nelson, I appreciate it. You joining. Any last thoughts, comments? Did I miss anything?
Well, probably just more to reiterate what you just mentioned. If it's even a thought, reach out. Having a conversation with us or with anyone else or who might be able to help. Don't wait until it becomes a real issue, which is unfortunately what many of us do just by nature. Be proactive, to your point. Reach out, even just to have an initial conversation, just to start framing it in your own mind, the different solutions you can put in place. Because we've had conversations with people when they had that. And while we were not a fit to help them, I was able to point them in a direction where they were able to get the help that they needed much quicker instead of waiting for it to become a real issue. So be proactive. If it's even a thought in your mind, do I need it? Do I not? Reach out and have a conversation, again, with us or somebody else who you think might be able to help you, but don't wait for it to become a real issue.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you everyone for the questions, for the comments. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.